Folks, there is currently a situation brewing between the Vancouver Canucks and one of their best players. We will discuss why Bill Guerin needs to be keeping a very close eye on Elias Pettersson's status on today's episode of Locked on Wild.
You're Locked on Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, this is Brandon Duham, and this is Locked on Wild.
What is happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked on Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you, as always, for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Sleeper. You can download the Sleeper app and use promo code LOCKEDONNHL to get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. See Sleeper's terms of use for details. On today's episode of Locked on Wild, we discuss what is going on between Vancouver and Elias Pettersson with his new potential contract still not even remotely close to being negotiated between the two teams. It is a bit of a long shot, but we'll talk about why the Wild absolutely should be involved if Pettersson somehow ends up not re-upping in Vancouver. My name is Seth Topol, your daily Minnesota Wild insider, and folks, it's a long play, but I'm telling you right now, if Elias Pettersson does not re-up with the Vancouver Canucks, this is one situation in which I would be fully on board with this team deviating from their current plan to make work. Pettersson is something. Pettersson is a big game fish. And that is not something that this Minnesota Wild team has had a ton of success courting or landing. But I want to just paint a picture for you to start. We'll talk about Pettersson, what he brings to the table, and we'll look at the possible scenarios in which Bill Guerin could make this work. I want to paint a picture for you of a scenario in which the Minnesota Wilds can roll out Elias Pettersson and Eriksson Ek as their top two centers in the lineup. And your top six is some combination of Kirill Kaprizov, Elias Pettersson, Eriksson Ek, Zuccarello, Matt Boldy, and whoever else. Danila Yurov. At that point, honestly, that sixth player doesn't really matter a ton. It would give the Wild something that they have not had throughout the course of their franchise history, with the exception of maybe the tail ends of a couple of seasons ago, once the Kevin Fiala line got figured out with Matt Boldy and Freddie Gaudreau. This would give the Wilds an opportunity to have two dominant scoring lines that could match up with everyone else in the Western Conference. Every single other team in the Western Conference. Elias Pettersson is currently 24. He is on pace. He's on the brink of turning in his third consecutive 30-goal season. He is on pace for a second consecutive 100-point season. He is a rare talent that just does not get to this point often. And yes, I will say again, this is a long shot. This is not likely to happen. But we just talked about on the national show earlier today the fact that Pettersson's camp and the Canucks are still pretty far apart and haven't done a ton in the way of negotiating, largely because he's not entirely sure yet if he wants to commit to Vancouver. Because you look at where the Canucks are at right now. Pettersson's been through some lean seasons. Vancouver is definitely on their way up, but Vancouver also has a lot of roster uncertainty beyond this season. They have a lot of positions on that roster that are going to need to be figured out, and there just is an appeal to playing in other spots as opposed to a market like Vancouver. So it's a non-zero chance that Pettersson walks, but in the event that he does, the Minnesota Wild need to quickly get to action, because I'm telling you, this could provide an opportunity for Bill Guerin to get an assurance that Kirill Kaprizov would stick around. You get a player like this, you get a guy like this who is currently statistically the 8th best forward in the entire NHL right now at the age of 24. A talent that you don't find the opportunity to potentially get. Now, there are a couple of ways in which this could play itself out. Let's just say for argument's sake that Pettersson sours on the Vancouver experience and wants to try greener pastures. Like, let's say this is Vancouver's shot, and they don't end up making it to the Stanley Cup final, maybe get to the Western Conference Finals, maybe get upset in round 2. And Pettersson sours on what Vancouver is doing and decides he would like for there to be, he'd like for a little bit of a change of scenery and maybe commit long-term to a different location. The Wild need to sound the alarms and rally to find a way to do this, because this is currently not a team that is set up for a Stanley Cup run. But what do we know? What do we know about this team at this point? Is that within the next 2 years is when the hope is that their legitimate contention window will open up. So let's just look at some things that could be done to make this happen, because it is tantalizing enough. It is tantalizing enough for me to try to make all the pieces work, because he's that good of a player. And it is funny because I was sitting in Locked On Canucks. I was sitting in their live stream the other day just at work, and there was a lot of chatter from fans about just being ready to move on from a guy like that, which is, I think that would be a mistake for Vancouver. So let's just play it out. Let's just see what would need to happen in order to make this work. We'll discuss that as we continue today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Sleeper. And as we move closer to the end of the regular season, with a couple of months left for the playoff push, you can still win big by playing daily fantasy hockey on Sleeper, the official daily fantasy app of the Locked On NHL Network. Sleeper is our number one choice for daily fantasy sports, especially daily fantasy hockey. Because with Sleeper, you can win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contests. All you need to do is pick whether your favorite players, Kirill Kaprizov, Matt Boldy, Eriksson Ek, or more, will record more or less than their sleeper projections for things like goals, assists, saves, plus minus, and more in a given game. You can fill your entries out in less than 60 seconds. And if you love other sports, You can play daily fantasy NFL, NBA, MLB, and college football on Sleeper too. Use promo code LOCKEDONNHL and you'll get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's code LOCKEDONNHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details and locational availability. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure to join us after tonight's game against the Carolina Hurricanes, which you can also be listening to on the SiriusXM app. So tune in on the SXM app to listen to the Minnesota Wild currently in progress against the Carolina Hurricanes. We'll have a Locked on Wild postcast coming up for you after tonight's game, as we typically do. But with a long workday once again, had this Elias Pettersson news on my mind, and so wanted to get you an episode here this evening that you can turn on while you have the Wild game on in the background. So let's get back to this. And again, I stress because this is a long shot, but I'm of the belief that if there is even an inkling that this is going to be a possibility, you got to start moving mountains, because let's talk about the first hurdle to this. So Pettersson is currently in the final year of his deal. He is arbitration eligible next season. So the Canucks hold his rights. So let's say Vancouver gets to the end of the season and they do not advance to the Stanley Cup final. They get bumped in round 2, round 3, and just do not get the opportunity to hoist the Stanley Cup. I would imagine the large majority of the Pettersson negotiations are going to kick up in earnest in the offseason. There's still plenty of time for Vancouver to get this done. And you are looking at Pettersson getting a hefty bump from the $7.35 million he's currently making to double digits. Like, you can probably pencil him in for 12 at the least for his next deal. And look, he is very much worth that price. It's hefty, but he is a top 10 player in the NHL right now. And that is something that status, money buys that status. So if he gets 12, you obviously have to find a way to work that into the books. Like, let's just say he says no to Vancouver. He says, I'm not going to do it. So Vancouver even says, well, let's just kind of see how things go. Let's go to arbitration. And let's play this out. So you go into arbitration. He gets whatever he gets in arbitration. Vancouver goes through the season next year. This feels like this would be way too big of a black cloud to be hanging over their head during a season, but they're in the season, and Pettersson says, I'm not going to do an extension. So then Vancouver's like, well, we either deal him at the deadline or we get nothing. So then they have to kind of quickly pivot to get something back from him so he doesn't just walk for nothing. Now, maybe the Wild don't get involved there because that's going to be a hefty price. You're talking about a first-round pick. You're talking about a top-level prospect. You're talking about a young NHL player and probably an NHLer as well, at minimum, for what it would take to get Elias Pettersson. The Vancouver Canucks currently have on their roster currently have 2 defensemen who will be on contract next season. Philip Hronek is a restricted free agent, so the Canucks have his rights. Tyler Myers, unrestricted free agent. Nikita Zadorov, unrestricted free agent. Ian Cole, unrestricted free agent. Noah Juleson is on his entry-level contract, and so he's on just a 3-year deal. My mistake. But he is an unrestricted free agent for the 2025-2026 season. And you got Quinn Hughes at 7.85. That's it. That's all they have for the blue line for Vancouver. So they're going to need some things to try to get that blue line figured out, which is why it's interesting. And I'll talk more about this in tomorrow's episode, in which we'll just kind of run through the latest trade rumblings. Vancouver's interested in Johnny Vibes, John Merrill. Okay, you can have him. Like, you can have him. But here's another out of the box thing for me. So the Wild have a ton of high level contracts as of right now. You've got Kirill's deal, you've got Matt Boldy's deal, you've got Joel Eriksson Ek is not what I would call a heavy contract. 5.25 for what he does is an extreme bargain deal. But then on defense, you got Jonas Brodin at 6. You've got Jared Spurgeon at 7.575. You're going to have Brock Faber at a high level too. What if you take this opportunity, since Jared Spurgeon's contract goes down to a modified no trade? What if you take the opportunity there to free up $7 million? And we've talked about it. We've talked about it extensively. I'm concerned. I'm not super confident in Spurgeon being able to come back at a high level, considering the 2 surgeries that he just had done or is having done over the next couple of months. But if he's not able to come back, what that ends up doing is, like, let's say the outlook for him coming back at all is pretty slim. That becomes a long-term injured reserve cap cushion weapon. Shea Weber. Remember how many times Shea Weber got traded around because that contract was just insane. You could give Vancouver the opportunity to have him on roster and to add above the standard salary cap. And, you throw in a pick, you throw in a prospect. I'm telling you, folks, this is not as complicated as it seems. What would be required would be a ton of work to the lead up. And it's probably more likely that you wait if Pettersson, if he does say he's not signing, it's probably more likely that you wait until he becomes a free agent, because he might get traded to somebody who he's not going to sign an extension with. And so then they get him next trade deadline as a rental. What a rental that would be. And then you go full bore at him, and you have contracts on your books right now that would equal up a lot of money if you found ways to do something about them. Freddie Gaudreau off the books. Marcus Foligno, Ryan Hartman. That's $9 million right there. Just like that. And you've got a lot of young players that'll be coming up that will be on cheaper ELCs that can fill out the middle portion of that roster. Something to think about. because this represents a rare opportunity for you to add a core piece while you are on the up and up to really maximize your window of contention. I'm spitballing here, folks, but this is intriguing to me. It would require a lot of work, but this is intriguing to me to be able to get done. And Pettersson plays some wing too. Like I was looking at his numbers. He does not take a ton of faceoffs. Like he's only taken about 500 faceoffs this season, which is essentially the amount that Eriksson Ek has lost. But Eriksson Ek gets used a ton. And so, he's capable of playing center. He's capable of playing wing. And then you put together a Kaprizov. Like, let's say he plays wing. Kaprizov, Eriksson Ek, Pettersson. Are you kidding me? I don't know. It's tantalizing, to say the least. Ultimately, it's a long shot. So we'll just have to keep a close eye on it, as we suggested that Bill Guerin does, because if that were to even be a possibility, I feel like you've got to take a hard look at it if you're the Wild. We'll finish today's episode by just taking a look at the roundup of some of the other news that we have for trades. So we'll talk about that to finish today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is also brought to you by Camino Consulting. You've heard of our online families and couples course and taken advantage of the Locked On 25% discount running to the end of the month. But what about the live seminars? In both sport and business, the challenge in differentiating candidates and recruits is an endless battle. Everyone can demonstrate their measurables and qualifications, but we all know it is the intangibles that matter when those things are similar. Contact Camino Consulting for their team and management seminars to get a peek behind the curtain and watch your next recruiting class or hiring group become one of the most effective you've ever seen, both because you've identified the right candidates and because you've learned how to communicate and motivate them in accord with their own preferences. What you aren't in business management or working with a team, we pay referrals. Make some money making your workplace and favorite teams better. Every group works together better at the end of year one rather than week one. So contact Camino Consulting at caminoconsulting.ca and get on the fast track to understanding. That's caminoconsulting.ca. caminoconsulting.ca. Final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. For the everydayers, we will take a look at tonight's new look combination. I've got some stats, courtesy of Brett Marshall, that we'll talk about this new look line combo that the Wild are trying tonight against the Carolina Hurricanes. And we'll get you set for a big end of the week as well. Just wanted to talk about some other trade chatter that we have for the Minnesota Wilds. It is interesting that it seems like Vancouver is sniffing around at a bunch of different pieces that are related to the Minnesota Wilds. We talked about the interest that Vancouver has shown in John Merrill. And I want to just read you what the piece says here, because I find this interesting in regards to Johnny vibes. John Merrill is just a sharp defensive defenseman. The 32-year-old left-handed blue liner is capable of playing either side defensively and is just about the perfect defensive defender for the contained manner in which the Canucks want to play. Merrill has been an occasional healthy scratch for the Wild this season and wouldn't necessarily factor into the Canucks lineup on an everyday basis if he were added ahead of the trade deadline. He'd likely profile as Vancouver's 7th or 8th defender once Carson Soucy returns. Nevertheless, Merrill has the size, intelligence, and experience to make all the difference on a team requiring safe minutes in mid-May. Signed this season and next at a $1.2 million cap hit, Merrill would be easy for the Canucks to fit under the cap this season. He would then provide them with a solid option this summer as they navigate a mess of expiring deals, including Philip Hronek, Ian Cole, Tyler Myers, and Nikita Zadorov along their blue line. Ladies and gentlemen, the fact that there are other writers around the NHL that have this opinion about John Merrill, Bill Guerin needs to pick up the phone yesterday and do it, because Merrill is not likely to play a ton with how Declan Chisholm has played, with Zach Bogosian set to return. And so if you can find a way to offload John Merrill, and then you go with Dakota Mermis and Alex Goligoski kind of rotating for that final third pairing spot, it's not great. I mean, I would much rather Mermis just get that spot, and just have it. But honestly, if you do want to work Goligoski in as kind of a change of pace guy that is not asked to do a ton, fine. That's fine. I'm not gonna get super worked up about that. But the fact that there are opinions out there that start with John Merrill as just a sharp defensive defenseman, go do this now, before that opinion changes, before teams dig into a little bit of film and say, oh no, he is not these things. Do it. The other one is Brandon Duhaime. The Canucks have been kicking the tires on Dewey number 1 and view him as a potential add maybe for their bottom 6 if it gets to that point. I think we all feel like it's going to get to the point with the Minnesota Wild that they have to do something with that bottom 6. There is a glut of players that you need to get some resolution on, and I feel like the way to get resolution on that group is to remove some bodies from it and figure out who are the ones that are going to play the best down the stretch and work them into the lineup. I am not a huge fan of the line that the Wild are currently deploying as their second line. Matt Zuccarello, Freddie Gaudreau, and Marcus Johansson. Not a fan of that. But it feels like, whether it be Brandon Duhaime, Connor Dewar, Pat Maroon, it feels like somebody is going to be sent elsewhere, maybe for just one of those, an opportunity for Bill Guerin to buy in on a young player that maybe needs a change of scenery. If those are the situations in which, if the Wild are getting picks or young players that maybe have kind of played their way out of a contending team and need a little bit of a fresh look, these are the types of things that should be done here. If they buy, look, they're right in the playoff picture, and so if Bill Guerin feels like there's an opportunity to buy, he's going to do it. But I think there's an opportunity here too for a little more clarity in that bottom 6, and I think that is important too for this team. is to just get a little bit of a better sense as to who's going to be out there. Because you've got, right now, you have Mason Shaw, Marcus Foligno, and Pat Maroon all either sitting or out injured right now. Marcus Foligno is not going to not be in the lineup, so he's going to take one of those spots. You'd imagine Pat Maroon will be in the lineup once he's ready to return. Who comes out? Who comes out? Just the answer to that question just feels like somebody goes off the roster. So we'll see. The other nuggets that Michael Russo put in pretty plain English, Michael Russo and Joe Smith, I believe. Marc-Andre Fleury is not going anywhere. There is, I would put it at a less than 1% chance that Fleury gets traded between now and the deadline. Wants to be here, wants to see it through to the end with this roster. Hard to argue with that. There would be an opportunity for him. I feel like somewhere else, Carolina, the team that the Wild are playing tonight, they're in the need of goaltending. The New Jersey Devils have a slim playoff chance themselves. They could use some goaltending. But that's the other part of the puzzle with giving out these trade protections. And I know in Fleury's case, because of his age, that's where his comes into play. But that's the thing with these trade protections is that if players want to stay, largely they get to. And so looks like Fleury's sticking around, which honestly for me, I enjoy watching Fleury do his thing. And so if he's here the rest of the way and, has a few more starts at the end of his career in which he looks really good, fine by me. That'll do it for tonight's episode of Locked On Wilds. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure to join us tomorrow as we will take a deep look into the new second line for the Minnesota Wild. We'll recap what they did tonight, as well as looking statistically at how their current inhabitants have been playing. So you can tune in for that. Make sure to tune in tonight for another Locked On Wild postcast as we recap tonight's game against the Carolina Hurricanes. You can find new content by subscribing on YouTube and listening to us on your favorite podcast platforms. We have new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.